Pod Save the World is brought to you by The Great Courses Plus. We all know you listening out there love to learn. You want to know as much as possible.
Love to learn.
So sign up. Start watching The Great Courses Plus. This is made for curious people like us. You get unlimited access to thousands of fascinating lectures. You can learn from passionate, engaging experts about anything that interests you.
Yeah, that series by Anthony Scaramucci on communicating at the White House is very interesting. Short, but very interesting.
Autofellatio by the Mooch. You can hear the history of Russia, mysteries of human behavior, and you could even learn how to draw. You can stream or download The Great Courses Plus or watch anytime, anywhere, your living room, at the gym, even on a plane. Everyone should check out the Great Courses Plus series on the modern political tradition. It looks at how political theorists over the last few centuries have approached the question of how a state is best governed.
You guys know that was the third time Tommy tried to read that sentence correctly?
Here's a joke.
He needs a great course on diction.
Is it governed by tweets? Find out. Right now, the Great Courses Plus is offering Pod Save the World listeners a full month free video lectures when you sign up using a special URL. Go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/crookedworld. That is thegreatcoursesplus.com/crookedworld. Learn some stuff today.
And after you spend an hour typing that URL, and maybe you'll have a little time left over to learn something.
Hello, Pod Save the World listeners. Thank you for tuning in. My guest today is a defense expert named Kelly Magsamen. We talked for a while about President Trump's speech last night about his new strategy for Afghanistan, and we talked about previous efforts to beat back the Taliban and get to a peace agreement in that country and why it has been so difficult for 16 plus years. Kelly is an expert in defense policy. She's also brutally honest about the failings under both administrations. So I think it is an important piece of context for a very, very difficult problem. Joining me on Pod Save the World today is Kelly Magsamen. Kelly is one of those public servants that I've talked about many times who worked in national security positions under Democrats and under Republicans. She was most recently the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. Prior to that, she was on the NSC in various positions, including Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning, Director and Senior Advisor for Middle East Reform in the wake of the Arab Spring. I'm sure that was really fun. And Director for Iran, which meant she was in all the really cool meetings about Iran. Kelly, thank you so much for being on the show.
Great to be here.
So I wanted to jump on the phone with you to talk about President Trump's speech last night and the policy he laid out. So I figure we'll leave the style points to the cable shows. What did you think of the policy Trump laid out for Afghanistan? He didn't talk about troop numbers. He didn't talk about how we'll measure success. He didn't talk about a time frame for withdrawal. What do you think of the policy was, and what was new here?
To be honest, I thought the speech was, underwhelming. I guess it could have been worse. My biggest takeaway was really the disconnect between what he was laying out as our objectives and then actually the strategy itself. And what I mean by that is he sort of put an emphasis on fighting terrorism and defeating the Taliban and sort of suggested that, whatever adjustment he was making was going to achieve that objective. He didn't really define winning in any sort of appreciable way. There was no real sense of what the actual goal was. All the stuff that we actually needed to hear from him was very, very vague.
Right.
So having no end goal other than it not being nation building is, pretty problematic. And I think, if the reports are right that he's going to send 4,000 troops, that's not going to make a measurable difference in turning the tide on the Taliban. I think it'll help, fill some training gaps. It'll give General Nicholson a little bit more flexibility to send, trainers out to, districts at the battalion level. But it's really not a silver bullet for success in Afghanistan.
So can you describe in sort of basic terms, what is the current mission? Like, what are U.S. service members doing in Afghanistan today?
So we currently have two missions. We have a train, advise, and assist mission called the Resolute Support Mission, and that's actually us and our NATO partners and allies training Afghan national security and defense forces to, do the fight themselves. So that's mission number one, and that's the bulk of our forces are actually devoted to that mission. The second mission is a U.S. unilateral counterterrorism mission, which is a totally separate mission. And we have about 2,000 or so troops devoted to that. So there are really only two missions. And what's interesting is that, General Nicholson, when he sort of suggested that he needed more troops, he was pretty explicit about wanting them for the train, advise, and assist mission and not the CT mission, which he thought he had adequate troops for. So what's interesting now is that the president is emphasizing counterterrorism, but I think largely the troop increase is going to go to the training mission.
Oh, that's really interesting because the CT mission is probably being handled primarily by special forces, the most highly trained individuals in our military, whereas the training mission can be handled more by rank and file, right? Or people who are specialized in training of soldiers.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's a little hard to separate the two. I mean, they obviously feed off each other. I mean, one thing I think people need to understand about the counterterrorism mission is that we need, an intelligence infrastructure around the country. We need good intelligence. We need good human intelligence networks. And so some of that interacts with other things that we're doing around the country. So it's not super easy to separate the two, but there are two distinct missions.
Right. Big picture, how are things going in Afghanistan? How strong is the Taliban? How confident are you in the government's ability to provide security and services and keep control of at least major population centers?
Yeah, I think of it, kind of on three levels. On the security level, we went in there to defeat Al-Qaeda, which is basically defeated. Mm-hmm. But we've got this raging Taliban insurgency. And it's true that they are, able to sort of pick up more and more districts. Now, some of that's, expected. We don't expect the Afghans to retain every single district. But it's happening a lot, and it's, they're really pushing the Afghan forces. And the Afghan forces are having a really hard time, blunting their insurgency. You've got also new terror groups starting to pop up, like ISIS, although, lower levels earlier this year, but are starting to rise up. So you have kind of a really crappy security picture. Mm-hmm. The Afghan National Security Forces, they're hardworking guys, but they're suffering, really high casualties and attrition rates. I mean, it's pretty profound. And so, the security situation doesn't look good. I mean, General Nicholson called it a stalemate. That's probably about right, but it's a stalemate trending badly.
Right.
You're starting to see more high-profile attacks in Kabul from the Haqqani network, which is part of the Taliban. And that's putting pressure on the Afghan government. And then the Afghan government itself, is constantly at war with itself politically. There's this cold marriage between Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah, which we constantly play marriage broker for. Economic growth is not good. They have rampant, corruption across the country.
Yeah.
So the political situation doesn't look that great either. It's relatively stable right now, but it goes through kind of periods of instability. But the good news is there is some good news. We've got some good social indicators. Life expectancy rates are up. Mm-hmm. You've got 8 million kids, in school, but there are also a lot of Afghan civilians dying in this war. I mean, just about 30,000 so far in the conflict.
Wow.
So it's not a great picture.
Yeah. One other thing President Trump mentions pretty frequently is an argument that Obama's national security team was overbearing and constrained the military from operating the way it needed to operate, I guess is the only way to describe it. Can you talk about that? Can you explain what rules of engagement are and how things have or have not changed with respect to the military's rules of engagement or approach to civilian casualties from Obama to Trump?
Yeah, I mean, this is always a tricky issue. I mean, there's always a tension between the headquarters and the field mm-hmm. on these issues. I think it's important for people to understand that, U.S. troops are not performing a direct combat role.
Right.
And I think people forget about that. But that may change under President Trump. He wasn't clear last night about the kinds of new authorities he was granting them, so I'll be interested to see if he changes that. But, we try to, right now we're in a training, advising, and assisting role with the Afghans. And that means, our troops can sometimes go out to, spots that are dangerous to help the Afghans. But they're not the ones leading the fight. That's the Afghans. I think that could potentially change under the president.
Wow, that would be a significant
change. He alluded to it last night. He said, we're going to take the gloves off basically and give them the authorities to fight the Taliban. So I guess my question is, are we going to go back to war directly with the Taliban?
Right. Another thing President Trump talked about was putting a renewed focus on Pakistan. Again, that's not really new, but can you explain why Pakistan is so important to the security situation in Afghanistan and how that approach of this apparently renewed emphasis on Pakistan does or does not differ from previous administrations?
The Pakistan challenge, my favorite.
Yeah.
Well, listen, the fundamental problem is the Pakistanis are willing to fight terrorists that threaten them at home, but they're also willing to violently export violent proxies to advance their interests in Afghanistan. So that's a problem. And do the same thing with India. The challenge is that we want them to continue to fight terrorism in Pakistan. We don't want those tribal areas, to be safe havens for terrorists. So we do provide them a lot of assistance to help in that regard. It sounds like the Trump team is going to either, take away the assistance or, dramatically curb it. But I think, it's also important to understand that we need Pakistan for, supply lines, we call them the GLOCs, the ground lines of control. We need them for that. Now, whether or not we have an alternative to that, we'll see. So I think, cutting off security assistance or, designating their officials, which is something I read in the news today, that's going to make us feel better that we're kind of punishing Pakistan, but it's also going to potentially have costs for our interests. And we may be willing to pay those costs, but we need to have a plan for when that happens.
Yeah. The GLOCs are essentially how we supply our troops in Afghanistan, right? Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember back to some of the major ruptures we had with Pakistan around the bin Laden operation, around an individual who was apparently employed by the CIA who shot a couple of people at a traffic light. Things can get worse with the Pacs, but, they are double dealers in many respects.
Absolutely. And I think, listen, it's right that Trump team is focusing on Pakistan, but I just don't expect it to actually change Pakistani behavior at the end of the day, and it actually also make it a lot worse.
Mm-hmm. So today, the Trump administration, their communications team did a very good job for once, walking reporters through their Afghan review process, the president's thinking, how his views changed over time. But as I read those stories in the Times and in the Post, it felt like Groundhog Day. Like we did the exact same sort of review of Afghanistan policy and Pakistan policy and Southeast Asia policy in 2009. We debated the same questions. Steve Bannon, of all people, was quoted as saying something I thought was pretty smart, which was, for 16 years, from the neocons to progressives to Obama's people, they all thought they were making great decisions. Why are we any smarter than they are? He has a point. Has every president just fallen into a trap of somehow thinking that they're doing something new in Afghanistan that will yield different results when, on its face, these policy choices look very, very similar?
There are never any really good options with Afghanistan. I feel like I see that too much. But, I think it's a tough nut to crack. And you're right. We went through these same questions when we were deliberating on all these issues, and we came up with really, great answers. I think the challenge is that as long as the potential risks of leaving are higher than the known risks of staying, it's going to be very hard for any president to make that decision. I mean, it's always easier to start a war than to end a war. And I think the president, the current president, came in with a preconceived notion of what he was going to do, and then, he's surrounded by, veterans of the Afghanistan war who walked him through the potential downsides of leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's hard when a president's presented with those kinds of choices, and especially a president like this one, frankly, who doesn't have a lot of political courage, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Isn't going to, push back on some of that.
Right. You wrote a great piece for foreignpolicy.com today that sort of outlined your views, and I feel the same way as the position you articulated, that I'm torn here. I mean, I don't want the government in Kabul to fall. I don't want ISIS to find a safe haven in Afghanistan, so I'm sympathetic to requests from DoD to help fill the gaps in the training mission, but at the same time, I wonder, we've been doing this for 16 years. What has changed? We had 100,000 troops in Afghanistan in 2010 and 11, it didn't solve the problem. And as you wrote in your column, 2,400 U.S. troops have died in Afghanistan. 20,000 were wounded in action. We provided over $100 billion in assistance since 2002, and that doesn't include the money we spent doing the actual fighting. And then couple that with the fact that this military effort and this 4,000 new troops is reportedly the military output of this announcement last night, although he didn't say it for some reason. It's not paired up with any kind of diplomatic effort to try to get us to a peace process. So that's not really a question as much as me hand-wringing out loud, but what's your take? I mean, what do you think you would advise President Trump to do if you were sitting in the Oval Office last week?
Yeah, I mean, it is really hard. I mean, I think you point out the issue on the diplomacy. I mean, the Trump administration, is looking at this very much through the security lens, which is understandable, and that's what a lot of administrations do because it's a measurable lens, right? The number of troops you put in, et cetera. But really, at the end of the day, these conflicts end usually by political settlement. And what I didn't hear from the president last night, and we'll see if he clarifies in the coming days, but what is the strategy to actually bring the conflict to an end? And they talked about how it's important not to have timelines for withdrawal, which I can understand and I actually support. But let's keep in mind, the Taliban's not going anywhere.
Yeah, right.
And this additional kind of moderate increase in troops is not going to make that kind of a material difference. At some point, we need to be able to actually come to the negotiating table. Now, listen, maybe the theory is correct. You put in the troops. We'll see if we can get some momentum back on the security side, and maybe that forces the Taliban to the table in a productive way. I just don't see that happening. So I think at some point, we need to confront the reality. We could be there for a very long time. Some people have talked about how this could be our generation's Korea.
Yeah, General Petraeus talked about that, I believe.
Yeah. And I think that's, it's not always good to compare different countries and theaters of war, but I think there is something to, an American president leveling with the American public about the fact that we'll probably be there for quite some time.
Yeah.
Or, at some point we call the ball, let the chips fall where they may. But it's a tough. There is no, theory of victory that is going to be a satisfying theory of victory.
Yeah, and just to go back to the diplomatic piece you mentioned, under the Obama administration, we had a position that was called the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. The first person to hold it was Richard Holbrooke, who was a legendary diplomat, just like a towering figure at the State Department. Their sole job was to try to get the Taliban, the Afghans, the Pakistanis, the international community to the table to negotiate a peace settlement. And that is a brutally complicated, difficult process, but one that I think only happens if you're pushing for it on the daily basis. But they've eradicated that position, right?
They got rid of the office unceremoniously in the night. So, that's the thing. You need to have somebody whose sole focus it is to do the diplomacy. And you're right, it's every day being on the road, going to capitals, trying to organize, all of the disparate interests of these regional countries. And you need to have somebody do that, and they don't. The other thing was interesting is, for all the talk of the regional strategy, is very much focused on India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
But the looming large is China, in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And, frankly, the Chinese have been drafting off of our security investment there for quite some time. And so my question for the president and his team is, how do we get the Chinese productively engaged? But to do that, you've got to have somebody whose job that is.
Pod Save the World is brought to you by Blinkist.
Blinkist.
Love it. I've been watching you all day. You had 6 meetings.
I did.
You had 213 emails to respond to. And there were 72 books that you told me that you wanted to read one day while having a robust social life.
See, that's weird. That's a very specific number of emails. That's pretty accurate.
Yeah, our sponsor knew. Well, Blinkist can help you big time and get you back some of the time you've lost. It is the Blinkist app. They have over 2,000 of the best-selling nonfiction books transformed into powerful packs you can read or listen to in just 15 minutes.
Cool.
Pause for approval. Since you're listening to this podcast, you probably love the idea of learning on the go with your smartphone. Imagine if you could listen to the key insights of a nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. With Blinkist, now you can feast your mind on all the key ideas from the top best-selling nonfiction books like Why Nations Fail, The Myth of a Strong Leader, Crippled America. Probably don't need the cliff notes for that bad boy. I think we got the gist already.
Got the gist on that one. Yeah, this is great because I'm definitely not reading these books.
Yeah, me either. Forbes, BuzzFeed, The New York Times, Lifehacker, they're all talking about Blinkist. They were chosen in Apple and Google's best of selection for 2 years, and the app is used by over 2 million people.
You know what I need? I need a Blinkist.
Ooh, I like that's a good idea.
Which is just someone yelling, "It's about a war!" That's an old joke. That's somebody's old joke.
Right now, Blinkist has a special offer for my audience. Go to Blinkist.com/crookedworld right now to start your free trial or get 3 months off your yearly plan when you join
Can somebody
today.
tweet at me whose joke that is about Speed Reader who discovers that A Tale of Two Cities is about a war?
That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/crookedworld for your free trial or get 3 months off your yearly plan. Blinkist.com/crookedworld. Pod Save the World is also brought to you by Texture. At a time when it feels like it's never been harder to find the truth, supporting the free press is critically important. From its inception, Texture has supported journalism not just by offering access to great magazines, but also financially. A portion of every subscriber's fee goes directly to the publishers.
Magazine.
The Texture app has gone beyond delivering just the magazine itself. Fuck, now it's in my head. They've made it easy to find and enjoy the articles you want to read with daily recommendations, exclusive interactive features, videos, and more. Texture makes magazines easy, and there are so many great ones out there. Time, Vanity Fair, Rolling Stone, Popular Mechanic. One of those is not actually real.
You Pod Save the World nerds.
Texture,
you guys love magazines.
It's searchable. That's what's cool about Texture.
You push your glasses up on your noses and you just kick back with your iPad using Texture.
Just kick back, talk about soft power.
Wish there was a magazine to help you make friends, but there isn't.
Texture
just
is normally
Vanity Fair.
Texture is normally $9.99 a month, and you get over 200 magazines. But if you sign up right now at texture.com/crookedworld, you get a 14-day free trial. Someone listened to our continuity of codes complaints. I'm noticing that.
Good.
Why subscribe to just a couple magazines when you can have all of your favorites on your smartphone, your tablet, all the time for way less money?
We need to call it something else, not a smartphone anymore. It's just a phone now.
Just a phone, yeah. Right now, Texture is offering Pod Save the World listeners a 14-day free trial when you go to texture.com/crookedworld.
14-day free trial.
14 days free when you go to texture.com/crookedworld. Join the Texture. So can you talk a little bit more about China? I mean, is your point that they're looking to continue their investment in sort of minerals and other natural resources? Or like, what is their play in Afghanistan?
Their play is to watch us bleed while they kind of sit to the side and not have to get involved and maybe do a few investments here and there. I do think they may be getting a little bit more nervous about the security situation. So I think they probably will welcome an additional American security investment. But at some point, if China is going to be this new player in the international order, they've also got to step up.
Yeah. Do you think it matters that President Trump hasn't visited Afghanistan yet? I don't even know if he's gone over to Arlington National Cemetery and visited Section 60, which is the burial ground for many of the U.S. service members killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I ask that not to take a shot at him, but because I know how much those visits and how much those conversations impacted President Obama during his 2009 Afghanistan review process. And it feels like that is a critical piece of any decision about sending more troops.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a problem. I think his overall level of interest in the issue is actually a problem. I mean, he hasn't met with the general we have there, General Nicholson, which is also fascinating to me that he made such a major decision without actually personally talking to the commander. He hasn't visited. They don't have. It's just as if he doesn't want to deal with it.
Right.
And you can have a team. Thank God his team makes up for that, but they're not going to be able. I mean, if he's disinterested now on the front end of a decision, when things get really tough in the middle, what's he going to do? And what I thought was interesting about his speech last night, everyone's giving him a lot of credit for, explaining why he's reversing his position. But the way he explained it was just basically say, I'm going against my gut instinct here. I'm going to listen to the experts. And it's almost as if he's setting up a situation where he can, down the line, just say, you know what, I should have gone with my instinct. The generals were all wrong, and we're going to pull out.
Yeah.
It's almost he was very cynical about the way he approached it. And he's getting a lot of credit for it, which I think that's kind of fascinating to me.
That is interesting. I had not thought about it that way. And you're right. I mean, there is no shortage of wisdom and experience among that team when you think about General Mattis or H.R. McMaster or General Kelly. There does seem to be an acute shortage of diplomatic experience that could help him understand what is required to get to an end game and get to a point where we can peacefully withdraw from Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, Rex Tillerson is not that guy. I don't think he's going to step up and suddenly be the envoy on Afghanistan. I mean, really, we need a Richard Holbrooke.
Yeah.
We need a person of consequence who can play that role, and we don't have that right now. And the team is, listen, they're all hardworking and well-meaning. I have great respect for all of the folks in those jobs. But you've got to be able to understand that you have blind spots, and it's clear that diplomacy and political strategy is the president's blind spot.
Mm-hmm. There's been some reporting recently about Iran's growing influence in Afghanistan. that's not, I don't think, entirely new, but as an Iran expert and as a defense expert, is that something that concerns you or that you're seeing more of, or is this more of the same?
Interesting. We didn't. It's always ever present, and we just sort of kind of got used to it. But it's. I didn't see it as a growing thing. Now that I've been out of government now for several months, so maybe things have changed. But it wasn't the thing we were most concerned about on Afghanistan. What we're most concerned about, frankly, was sort of Pakistani behavior. So thinking about external actors. Now, interestingly, General Nicholson has also said that the Russians are meddling. And that's concerning to me because I do think that the Russians have, ill objectives towards us. And if they're, providing more support to the Taliban, that could be a problem over time.
Yeah. I know your focus earlier on in the Obama days was Iran, and that took up a hell of a lot of time. But, I mean, when you think about that 2009 decision and the enormous surge of troops and money that was sent over to Afghanistan, do you think that there were outputs that made that commitment worth it? I mean, was there a notable improvement in the situation on the ground, governance, anything? And I say that knowing that Hamid Karzai was in power for a lot of that time, and he was an utter nightmare to deal with on every level.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think it was worth it. The Karzai problem aside, I think, showing the American commitment, and, President Obama ran on Afghanistan being under-resourced and being the good war, and I do think it was important for him to make that decision. Whether or not it made a material difference, I think, at this point, I think we're seeing the answer to that.
Yeah, and you just made this point. When Obama ran for president in 2007 and 2008, talked about Afghanistan as the war we need to win. The strategic priorities were to bolster the government, to retake territory we had lost, build up Afghan security forces, and that was deemed like a core national security interest that we were willing to spend billions of dollars on and put tens of thousands of troops in harm's way. That was 2009, 2010. Since then, we've had the Arab Spring. We've had the complete collapse of Syria. You've had the rise of ISIS. When you think about that current global security situation, what's your cold-blooded assessment of where we should rank the Taliban in our interest in Afghanistan versus all the other stuff going on?
Listen, any administration and president has to look across the horizon and see all the problems. I tend to think that at this point in time, when the world is kind of questioning our reliability, and we've got all these threats popping up, and it just feels like we have a lot to handle, I think that inducing more instability in Afghanistan by leaving would be worse than what we're dealing with now. And that's just a cold assessment.
I read that in your piece in Foreign Policy, and I thought that's one of the first arguments that made sense to me. Like, I despise the argument that you read all the time that's like, we need to do X in Y country to send a message to some other country, like North Korea or Iran. Yeah. But what you said there made sense to me on some level, at least.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there are opportunity costs, to what we're doing for sure. I mean, I've alluded to one on China, but at the same time, there are risks, and when you're trying to balance the risks across the board, you tend to make tough choices.
Pod Save the World is brought to you by Stamps.com. OG podcast ad, guys. These days, you can get practically anything on demand. Like
some laundry detergent delivered to my house in a pinch.
That's good.
Because I had to run and I needed laundry detergent because I was running out of clothing.
That's bad. So you can get detergent when you want. You can get great audio whenever you want, when it's convenient for you. So why are you still going to the post office and dealing with their limited hours when you can get postage on demand with Stamps.com?
I like to have heavier things delivered.
Me too. Anything you can do at the post office.
LaCroix.
You can do right now from your desk with Stamps.com. Buy and print official U.S. postage for any letter and package using your own computer and printer.
Detergent.
Unlike the post office, Stamps.com never closes. You can get postage whenever you need it, 24/7. We have Stamps.com at our office.
We do. You know what else we got delivered to our office?
What?
A bust of Benjamin Franklin. Because I'm in charge of decorating the studio, and I have a company credit card.
And that is why there's a bald eagle on the desk next to me. Right now, use promo code Crooked World 444 for this special offer.
Stamps.com has actually been really great for us
They're
at
awesome.
Crooked.
It's super useful.
We use it constantly. We're constantly mailing things out because, people come on the pod. We want to mail them a shirt. We say, thanks for coming on the pod. One time we got a package at the office and I was like, oh, I'm excited. What's in there? And I opened it. It was filled with bags, which is the lamest thing. You open up a box that's filled with bags. But anyway, those bags got stamps supplied to them via Stamps.com, and then out went the T-shirts. Nobody's going to the post office anymore. That's time. And time, as a businessman, I can tell you.
Time is money.
Time is money.
Yeah. So go to Stamps.com, and before you enter anything else, click on the radio microphone at the top of the homepage and type in Crooked World. That's Stamps.com. Enter Crooked World. Never go to the post office again. Last but not least, Pod Save the World is brought to you by the wonderful people at Postmates. Postmates is not just the ad where we try to make Lovett feel triggered. It is the way you can get anything delivered to your house.
Anything
you want. Laundry detergent.
That's right. We talked about this earlier. I had laundry detergent.
Yeah.
I had soda delivered. I had a bunch of Kind bars delivered. I got a bunch of stuff delivered to my house.
Hannah's out of town this week. I've gotten all my meals from them.
Yeah.
Very, very lonely.
Tommy's surrounded by empty boxes, just weeping.
Googling Venezuela and Afghanistan all night long.
We love Postmates.
We love Postmates. And if you download Postmates for the first time and you enter the code PODSAVE, you get $100 of delivery credit.
Why'd you look at me like you wanted me to say something?
I literally forgot what the
you
fucking
did.
thing did.
Honestly, I went to another place. I was not even here for a second.
Download Postmates.
$100.
Put in PodSave. $100
delivery credit.
Fantastic app.
Fantastic app.
The New York Times did a long piece at the end of the Obama administration that talked about sort of his journey on Afghanistan from those beginning days and the Afghan review and the decision to send tens of thousands of more troops there and to call it the war we need to win to, a decision to all but get out. I think they left, 9,800 troops in Afghanistan? Was that the residual force level?
It's actually around 8,400.
8,400, sorry.
Kind of where it's been lingering.
8,400, right. And one of the quotes in that story from President Obama was, we shouldn't assume that every time a country has problems that it reflects a failure of American policy. Now, obviously, that's, sort of in defense of his choices. But is there some truth to that? And is understanding and internalizing that and admitting that an important piece of U.S. foreign policy going forward for all these global challenges?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, there's the question of, how much agency do we really have? I tend to think that we as America, we're different, and I like the fact that we're different than the Chinese or others. So I do think we make a difference. But he's also right that, there are lots of factors at play in these countries. And, keep in mind, in Afghanistan, they call it the graveyard of empires for a reason. There's been a lot of countries that have struggled with this. The Russians themselves, the British, of course, fought their wars there as well. And, it's a tough place, and there's a lot of history. And sometimes we're not the biggest player. Sometimes it's the undercurrent of tribal movements. It's, sort of historical perspectives. So I think the president definitely has a point there, President Obama.
In 4 years, 10 years, what do you think is the best case scenario for Afghanistan? What should we hope for?
I think the best case scenario is that the place hasn't completely dissolved into an open civil war.
Cool.
And that we're largely, the security situation is maybe improving, and Kabul is still pretty secure, and the major population centers are pretty secure and under the control of the Afghan government. Mm-hmm. I think that's sort of almost status quo. In some ways, status quo might be the most we can hope for. I do really worry about a political breakdown in Afghanistan, almost as much as I worry about a security breakdown. And if the politics break down, between Ghani and Abdullah and all the factions, that's when things could get really ugly on the civil war side.
Right. Certainly the inability for the government in Iraq to be representative of the people, to make decisions, to do anything right, led to the rapid decline in the security situation there. But so does your vision for Afghanistan essentially mean that the tribal areas on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan will continue to be lawless, and that some of the southern provinces like Helmand province that have been, Taliban hotbeds forever will sort of be at best only partially under government control?
I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
I think we have to accept the reality that the Taliban are going to play a role in Afghanistan at some point. And my preference would be that role is, negotiated through a peaceful settlement as opposed to one on the battlefield. But I do think we have to accept the fact that there are going to be large parts of Afghanistan that aren't going to be, firmly under a central government control. So it's a hard reality, some people will say, well, you're just accepting defeat. But I think that this is how this is going to end. I mean, it's going to end in a way that Taliban has some role to play.
Right. I mean, people who disagree with that point, what do they think is going to happen? Do they think that we're going to just be able to kill every last individual or leader in the Taliban? Like, I don't understand. I'm trying to paint a picture of the counterpoint so people understand what that would look like, and I'm actually struggling to do it.
Well, we're not going to be able to, kill every single member of the Taliban because large parts of the population are the Taliban.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is again going back to this is not going. There's not a military solution to Afghanistan. It's going to end through a political solution. Now, the military effort can help you get to that political solution, which I think is the theory behind what they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
But what bothers me is that, if the idea is that somehow we're going to decisively win against the Taliban, the Afghans are going to decisively win against the Taliban on the battlefield with a few thousand more U.S. advisors, I mean,
it's ludicrous.
Kind of silly. Now, I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that, this does work. And I want our troops to succeed, and I want the Afghans to succeed. I just, we have to be clear, in terms of lining up our means to our ends.
Yeah. Well, I guess to sum it all up, I'm glad President Trump gave the speech last night. It continues to be strange that, you just never hear about what's happening in Afghanistan. It's completely off the news, off the front page of the paper. So, it's good that he talked about it. It's, I think, pretty bizarre not to offer the American people any kind of clarity about the troop increase number or their core mission when I believe all of that will have to become public at some point, right? Because of congressional briefings or,
yeah, he's going to have to tell Congress at some point.
Yeah, so anyway, well, whatever got them through a news cycle, I guess. But I think this was a very, very tough policy challenge for President Bush and then President Obama and now President Trump, and it will remain that way.
Well, thank you for talking about it because, Afghanistan doesn't really get much attention, and, most Americans are psychologically shut it out of their mind. And so I think it's important. We need to talk about it with folks on the ground out there.
I read someone who described it as the American people almost have a psychological break from the war in Afghanistan. It's like they just sort of need to not talk about it anymore. But you're right. We should talk about it. So thank you for coming on the show and offering wisdom and experience and just...
And all the right answers, of course.
All the right... But look, I think more important than right answers is honesty about failings along the way. And I really appreciated you offering those insights and talking with me today.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thanks, Kelly.
Bye.
Bye.